Welcome to a special edition of the Darden Admissions podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. On this episode of the podcast, we return to our ongoing spotlight on faculty here at the Darden School of Business, a series we call Office Hours, with a conversation with Yiorgos Allayannis. Yiorgos is a member of the finance faculty here at the Darden School of Business. And in this wide-ranging conversation, we talk about his background, what brought him to Darden. We also spend a considerable amount of time talking about one of his courses, financial institutions and markets, as well as a number of the cases that he's written over the course of his time here at Darden. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. So without further ado, here's my Office Hours interview with Yiorgos Allayannis. Thank you so much for being here. And so Yiorgos, tell us a little bit more about who you are. What's your background?
Hi, Brett, and hi, everybody globally. That's so wonderful to see that you guys are dialing in from wherever, all over the world. And I find the world fascinating. Having come, I grew up in Greece. First of all, it's great to be here. Great to be with you, Brett, and thank you for the invitation. I've been at Darden for a long time, almost 27 years, so quite some time, and it's been a great home for me. And so I'll say more later. But I grew up in Greece, just outside of Athens. I went to school there. I went to the National Technical University of Athens. So I studied electrical engineering and computer engineering. And I found very soon that I wanted not to interact just with machines, but actually also interact with people. And but it was a fantastic background to have. I didn't really know at the time, but it turns out that finance is actually one of the very engineering subjects of business. So knowing a little bit of how to do differential equations was helpful, at least in my PhD years. So then, I basically went straight to an MBA, which was very unusual, but that was late 80s. By the way, they were pre-internet, so you just have to mail your applications in. Brett, I know I'm dating myself here, and I was fortunate actually to be admitted by University of Massachusetts in Boston. Straight from undergrad. And so what did I know about the world of business and so on? But it was so eye-opening. I was actually also a research assistant to some faculty there. And that was also eye-opening because that got me sort of to think about, a bit of research and a bit of understanding how do we come about, the new knowledge that we teach our students. And so I was, people were saying, hey, you have time, why don't you do a PhD? And I said, after the MBA. And I said, okay, that sounds, I was always drawn into teaching, I have to tell you. While I was in undergrad, I was something very popular in Greece. You tutor, you do a lot of tutoring for, pocket money, which was not so pocket actually at some point. And, I taught very different subjects I was teaching high school kids, and it was, mathematics, it was physics, it was chemistry, it was even German. So it was like so many different things. And, one-stop shopping in a way, whatever you want, I'll teach you. And I was so fascinated by just the way people learn and how can I make things clearer, easier. What is the process of learning? How does learning stick? All kinds of things. I mean, it was just so enjoyable to see the students progress. I think that was the biggest takeaway. And so I had that in the back of my mind. And so when somebody said, why don't you think about a PhD? That was in a way not so far-fetched. I said, hey, I need a PhD to teach. And so then the question was, what subject? And so there was actually some competition between strategy and finance. And I quickly found out that my background was more attractive to finance than to strategy. I don't know what background I should have had to do strategy, but the good news is that I was accepted to NYU, which was a great place for finance. And for those of you who don't know, it has like 50 faculty members in finance. And so what's helpful about that is that you can really explore the different sides of finance and the different topics. And you can find professors basically that you would like to work with because you find the topic interesting and so on. So there's all kinds of different fields in finance, including a broad field about asset pricing that we call it, which is about how prices are formed. And then there's corporate finance, which is how corporations fund themselves, how they finance, what do they do with them, with the cash flow afterwards, and so on. And then there's also theory and empirical work. So you can do theoretical work, but you can also look at data and look at empirical. And so I was actually very fortunate to be at a place like that because I could choose, and I chose to do empirical corporate finance, which served me very well. So and after NYU, basically not after, during your last year, you go in the job market, which is a fascinating experience in and of itself, because you mail in applications at that time. Again, Brett, I think it was the internet had started, but I don't know exactly. They were still wanted to have a package. So I remember we were like mailing those in, and with letters of recommendation and your papers, basically your thesis, and then you're waiting for the first round. You wait for a call, and I'm sure now there are like WhatsApp, or text. I don't know exactly what's going on right now, but at that time you were waiting for a call, and it was just a big stress, like over the voicemail, right? Anyway, so you get those, and then you go to a conference, and at that time in that conference, you just go from one hotel room to another, depending on where the different schools are. And you open the door, and there's 5 faculty members across from you, so it's it could be quite intimidating, it takes a little bit of adjusting to it, because you run from one hotel to another and from one room to another, and you just try to keep it straight. After 20 interviews or so, what have I said to who, when? But what was very fascinating, you always have some schools that you're focused on, that you think that, those are the ones that will allow you to grow and carry on with your life and your career and so on. And honestly, Darden was one of them, but I didn't know as much about the school. But my interview was amazing. I loved sort of hearing about more about Darden, and sort of the emphasis on the teaching side, the emphasis on developing leaders, the emphasis on really working with our students, getting close to them, and bring the best in them, see them grow, make this non-transactional. This is sort of a lifelong relationship that you see and you enjoy. Now after having spent 27 years at Darden, I can attest that it was all true. That it's not something you teach somebody and then you never see them again, or you never hear from them again. There's some students that are everywhere, and but when I went to India, for example, for a program, we had a reception, and it was so great to see some students I hadn't seen in 15 years, and there was still the same connection with them. And the interesting part you might find is that they did remember things I told them, and they're like, you told us X. And I'm like, I don't remember, sorry. The good news was that actually what I had told them was right, so that was good. I was like, okay, early on in my career, it was, you're just trying to learn as much as possible, and you try to, to develop your own thinking of how you want to educate people, right? And so anyway, it's just such a always thrilling moment to see former students anywhere, from New York to Delhi, to Buenos Aires, to all kinds of, Rio, all kinds of places that I have luxury to spend time, and you're always learning as to how things evolve and so on. So anyway, there was, going back to the story about how I got to Darden, it was a nice, first of all, there was like something really great about the interview and the approach, and I'm sure all of you guys who have been in an interview and done an interview, you come away from an interview and say, okay, I'll never want to go to that place because there's no connection, and there's other places where you like, this is where I want to go, and Darden was really one of the, I would say, few places that I felt like really great connection. My two colleagues who, have recently retired actually. So I was very fortunate to be colleagues with them for so long and learn from them. Amazing colleagues. And that drew me, really, when we talked about how seriously we take our job to develop leaders and to develop responsible leaders for the future. And I didn't want to be in academia to just sit in an office and just close my door and think big thoughts. I like to do that too, and we have time. I mean, this is the nice thing about being in academia, where you actually have some time where you can, except for like emails from Brett that disturb you and say you just have to do like now thank you, Brett, like a webinar, you can think big thoughts and you can write new pieces and so on. So anyway, but if I am to be in academia, I just really wanted to engage fully and 150% into educating the future leaders. And imagine we have the privilege to spend 2 years with incredible talent and incredible promise, and it's our obligation, it's our duty, but it's also our blessing in many ways to be able to be in that position to shape somebody's future. And so I think we all at Darden take this very seriously, and it's been honestly life well spent. And I can't think of a better way to really spend my life. And we'll talk later. I know I had some deviations, in Wall Street and so on, and we can talk more about that. Feel free to chime in. Feel free to ask questions. I can go on and on. As you can imagine, this is actually, not my usual when I teach, because we're teaching in a different way, and I don't know. I can go on in that direction or something else. You tell me, Brett. I'm waiting for your cue. I said a lot.
Well, that's all good. Let's talk a little bit more about how you do teach here at Darden. Some of our attendees may know that Darden is what you would call a case method school. Case method is one of the principal ways you learn here. We also have experiential-based classes too, but you hear a lot about case method and Darden. So you teach finance. And so how does a case discussion go? How do you prepare for a case, and then how does it play out, particularly with a more quantitative topic like finance?
Right. I think it's so well suited actually for quantitative topics as well as for non-quantitative topics. I think the key thing to think about a case method is is engagement. And if I go one level higher, how do we learn? Well, a precondition of learning is engagement. So if I'm disengaged, basically I send text to Brett while I'm in the class, there's no way I will learn. It's like I may learn something from Brett, but not from the professor. So the key thing is you gotta be engaged as a precondition to learning. Now, you can't exactly force it, right? So you have to be able to. It's kind of like watching a movie. Nobody will force you to watch a movie. You just have to be sort of immersed because of what you find interesting and what's the purpose. So every case has a purpose, has a goal. We have these learning objectives before we write any case. And I write a lot of cases, but before you write any case, you have to think about, why am I writing this case? What do I have to teach on this case? Why is this case versus another case important, right? In a case, I think of it as a story, right? It's a real story. Sometimes it's actually also imaginative. It's like a script, like you're like a director, and you're trying to think about how this whole thing is going to play out in class. And essentially, you're thinking of a sequence of questions, and then a sequence of potential answers. But you want to orchestrate this in a way that basically makes learning clear and obvious. And sometimes it's murky, which is also very fun. I'll give you an example. So let's say I wrote a case on let me see which one. I have written so many. I have to think of one now. So I wrote a case on Deutsche Bank and the regulatory environment on Basel III some time ago. And Basel III was a regulatory environment that forced certain rules on banks on how much capital or equity and other forms of equity they need to hold. So you start in by the question, the first question, and you launch the case by asking, the famous cold call. You ask a student and you say, I don't know, Brett, since you are in front of me. So Brett, I can ask Samson from Alexandria, or, Lei from Yangon, or Henry in China, but now he's in Boston, and so on. I can say, Henry, what would you do in this case and why? What are the strategic questions that you have to really think about and answer? And then I can go, I can start from like a very broad thing. And you can say, we have to think about, I don't know, the corporate governance of the bank. The bank is not doing that great, blah, blah, blah. And this was 2013 when I wrote that case. And then slowly but surely you can get more people involved, right? Where you can say, I started with Henry, then I go to Samson. Samson, what do you think about, what Henry said? And start a conversation. And slowly but surely, you write some things on the board, and you're trying to basically unfold the case. And I think what is fascinating about a case is that no one has the full picture, including the CEO of the company. So, you can't expect exactly, the students to really know everything about it. So you just slowly but surely, and working together, you bring about this knowledge that you didn't know was there. And you're pointing to things in the case because it's very data driven, right? So you just say, according to, I look at figure 1 and, stock price is not doing well. And so why does the market penalizing you? Because they're afraid that you don't have enough capital, and raising capital is always not a very good thing for a bank. That means that you don't have enough, and it's very costly, et cetera, et cetera. So you just go through this exercise. And I think what's fascinating is how much first, how much you push yourself to really think collaboratively about everybody else in that conversation, and really uncover the things you didn't know. And I think in the end, it's almost like, wow, what did we do here? And it's a very different thing from me going in front of the classroom and, kind of pontificating. Here is the strategic issues. Here is what you do. Here is what you. Sometimes I don't have the full answers myself, right? I mean, I've thought of a lot of things of what's going to go on in this classroom environment, but there are surprises. And somebody may have worked in this bank or in another bank, brings in a different perspective that I hadn't completely thought about. And it's also a great learning experience for me as well. So it goes both ways. And I think just adding to the knowledge bit by bit, and coming up with arguments to strengthen your position or support your position, is really what you will be doing later on in your jobs. I tell my students, imagine you go to a place where you do 2 years of MBA and you never opened your mouth. What a waste of time. Because when you go to any place to work, you have to open your mouth and you have to really argue with reason and logic and be based on data to support your arguments. And so what I tell people is, like, every class is like a board meeting. And so what would you say to convince the other board members? When will you say what you want to say? So you have to choose the timing as well. How much you're going to say, how much you're not going to say, how well will you listen? And how would you lead? So there's like everything right there. And I think that's why, our students feel extremely prepared in their next phases of their lives. And they still want to see me in Delhi and Buenos Aires and New York after all these years. So it's honestly so gratifying to, and it never gets boring or old, because there's always new issues that you write about and new stories. And like in the banking, sector that I'm teaching is constantly, right? So there's always something new that is happening. But in every field, and so I think by the ability to sort of write about the new stuff, make everybody very current. At the same time, you don't dismiss the history, because I say there's not that many great ideas. There is a few great ideas that get repeated, and we forget about how these great ideas got us into trouble at some point, and then they morph themselves in a different way. An example of this is, so I'm teaching quite a bit about the financial crisis, and especially, after I came back from Wall Street in 2007. So I wrote a lot about a financial crisis, and the big, in the middle of it was the mortgage-backed securities, so CDOs. And so I teach a case on CDOs, which is pretty fascinating, because it really encompasses the whole financial system. And so the different players, from investment banks to banks, retail banks, to rating agencies, to the regulators, to debt investors, to equity investors, to hedge funds, to asset managers. I mean, you name it. They were all in there and making money, and until they didn't. And so it's a fascinating story. And I don't think people realize that mortgage-backed securities had been invented 20 years before, 30 years before, 25 years before, until I teach the following case where it's an older case from that era. And wow, it's like this thing had disappeared and then it's just like came back with a vengeance. And of course, we didn't pay attention to some of the parameters of, the inputs to a model that basically got us into trouble later on. And so we dissect sort of, first of all, the reason for a financial instrument, a financial product to exist, and then how it can be misused and abused, actually, and cause us trouble, for example. So it's fascinating. So you really have to understand the past. You have to understand the present. You have to understand there's all these new things that are happening, especially in finance. I would say, the basics are the basics, but you have like new fields like, cryptocurrencies, fintech, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that keeps you young, honestly, although gray hair, but keeps you young in spirit. And always something to learn, because it never gets boring. That's the other thing. And I think that's a great thing. The greatest thing about being a faculty, especially in a place like Darden, where you have basically a carte blanche to develop what you want to develop, and within your course, and just think about new ideas, and also think about new ways that you want to influence your students. So and that's not always like obvious. Just even after all these years, I always think very carefully about, why do I want to write this case? Is this something that I want to teach? What are the students going to take away from this? And then it gets more complicated, because you have to think about how this case fits with everything else that you have written and everything else that you do. So it's not just a case, but it's like essentially, you can think of like a movie or a theater play. I call it a Netflix series. So you get like, the first episode, the second, the third, and how this evolves, so that you can basically get, in a way, okay, it sounds cliche, but 1 + 1 is not 2, but it's 3. So how you can get this accumulation of knowledge and the progression over time that basically allows you to, I saw this before, and now I can basically use that knowledge to think something different, and therefore kind of create this this sequencing and this progression, and it's almost like I say every course has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's like and the end doesn't end, but it's kind of like you got that thing where you have to really pace it. How you start, like an example, you start with a very broad case that almost brings out all the issues that you want to cover later on. And it's not my invention. I learned so much from my colleagues, honestly, in how you think about a course, which is so different from courses in other places where, sometimes you feel like, chapter 1 today, chapter 2 tomorrow, chapter 3, isn't that boring? Somebody else has decided how you want to do things. But here, you really have to think about, okay, how do I write my own play, and why that makes more sense? I think ultimately that's the key, right? Is that if other people adopt what you do and are interested in what you do, it shows a bit that there's some market confirmation, to use a finance term. Hey, and sometimes you learn from mistakes as well. But the last thing to say on this is that over the years, I'm able to really go into places that I hadn't thought I would. An example is, I've taught like quasi strategy cases. So I got back to those people who did not think that my background was suited for strategy. It was fascinating, because it's also fascinating to see how you can basically write broader things, because after all, this is sort of an enterprise perspective that we teach at Darden. It's not like, oh, in finance you only do discount cash flows. That's it. Yiorgos, don't do anything else. No. I can really, because the problems don't come to you isolated, right? So there's like these broad issues that are strategic, that have a finance component, that has a hugely leadership and behavioral component. And so I wrote a leadership case. I've written several leadership cases in my course. My leadership faculty may not completely agree, but it's a. I mean, we're teaching on how do you become, let's say, a CEO of a bank. You got to, what does it mean to lead a financial institution? So anyway, so it's been so fascinating to explore all these issues and come up with a real feedback, right? Which is, the students love what you do, or the students feel like you should do more of this or less of that. And, the course has evolved with all the feedback that you're getting. And you can never reach the perfect course and the perfect case. You're trying, and, experience helps, I have to say. You know what has worked in the past, so what potentially could work in the future, but you're also taking risks. And that's what I love about Darden at this stage, so I wrote a case about a former student of mine who was an investment banker for 10 years. And then she decided to start a wellness company. She's from the Caribbean. And the case stopped where she had to make this decision. She was a very successful investment banker, and she had to make the decision: do I stick with investment banking or do I do something else? And it was I never done a case like this, and I had my student beamed in from the Caribbean, and it was like probably one of the best cases I've taught. Because it was so a little bit out of my comfort zone. So I had to really step up. And then, of course, you have the former student that you want to make that person also feel like, you've told her story well, and it has played out. I mean, that's the other thing. There's a real test. How, are the students involved, engaged? They really want to take position. And that's the other thing. I start the question: are you going to continue being a banker, or are you going to go and do something else? And you can start from that, and you can see the divergence, and then you have people talk about it and argue what she should do. Meanwhile, she's there, my student and sister. I mean, the last part to say, Brett, on this is, when you remember your student, she was a student from 2004. I mean, how was I 20 years ago, right? So it's a very different me than now. Hopefully more wise. Hopefully, who knows? But the students are at a certain stage in their lives, and certain knowledge and certain ways of, expressing themselves and so on. I mean, as you would expect. And then you see them 20 years later, or 18 years later, and you're like, whoa. I mean, the way they are expressing themselves, they would have aced it, back then. if they were, I mean, they would have been like, whoa. But you see this progression as a leader, and the way you are thinking through, and you can actually identify the Darden, a little bit the Darden imprint, a little bit. I mean, actually quite a bit, in terms of the logic to the arguments, the way they dissect the issues, the way they go about it, the way they think about the pros and cons, the way they think about, what do I want in life, the way on and on, right? I mean, it's just how can I get there? What does it mean? I mean, there's really deep conversation, on this one, but on so many others. And so anyway, it was like a great way to end the course last year. It was fantastic. So I think more to come.
Well, I want to take some time and talk about one of your classes here, a very popular elective that you teach, Financial Institutions and Markets. I will note I was on a webinar earlier this week with a number of ExecMBA alumni. We had a panel discussion, and they remember this class very fondly. Wanted to come to this discussion today. Such big fans of yours, and I know this class has evolved a lot. I think you launched it originally in 2008 after you got back from your time on Wall Street for the full-time MBA program, and then Executive MBA. I think this elective was introduced in 2017. And so tell us a little bit more about the course, and then we'll kind of get into some of the other questions I have.
Sure. So just, it was fascinating. When I came back from Wall Street, by the way, it wasn't clear that I was going to come back from Wall Street, but again, I had to think like a Darden MBA and decide, do I stay in Wall Street and as an investment banker, or do I go back? And a true story is that I actually bumped into a former student of mine in New York, and at the Museum of Modern Art, out of all places. And she was visiting from another country, actually. And I was telling her my big decision that I had to make. And she's like, Yiorgos, you're meant for Darden, you go back. And I was like, wow, okay, that was like, there was no hesitation there. Before I was like driving my wife crazy. Today we're leaving, we're going back to Darden. Tomorrow we're staying, and it was just like, because that life was also fascinating. I can talk about this as well. I learned so much. But anyway, I think when I came back, my area head asked me, actually, he was one of the people who were in my interview 20 years before, or whatever, 15 years before. And he said, what did you learn in Wall Street? I said, well, I covered financial institutions. He said, why don't you start a course on financial institutions? And that's basically how the genesis was. And I wrote a series of cases, on financial institutions about kind of strategic issues that they're facing in terms of capital, in terms of distributions, in terms of regulatory environment, and trying to analyze the crisis, understand where it came from, why, talking about incentives, talking about how do you get in a mess like this? And basically the inability to lead, it's a huge thing, and manage risks. It's a big component. My other research is actually, my academic research is all on risk management, or a big part. And so I come from a very, in a way, very deep place on understanding risks. And it's not so simple, because there's quantitative stuff and then there's qualitative stuff that it's harder to measure and so on. But anyway, so this is a parenthesis here. But I started the course, and then I had a big chunk on financial crisis and so on. And over the years, of course, I think we had the big change in the mid, 2015, 2014, a little bit earlier on fintech. So there were basically technology companies that are trying to solve financial problems in a sort of better way, more efficient, using algorithms. And luckily I had studied computer engineering, so I knew what an algorithm is, and how it works, and how you code on this, and you also understand the limitations, the biases, everything. So many things, right? And then you understand, having understood banks, or so I thought, you can see where the advantages and disadvantages of those two big players are. Like, when you are a bank, what are your advantages? When you are a fintech, what are your advantages, but also what are the disadvantages? So I wrote a case about this, which was great, with a student, and it was sort of the first case on understanding the space, and understanding what kind of areas fintech can improve. I wrote a case on payments, which is like a big, wide open field, and I wrote a case on M-Pesa, which is a very well known example of a Kenyan fintech, and how it evolved, and why they did what they did, and what are some of the pitfalls. I haven't been to Kenya, so I have to say, I mean, I've been to South Africa, and that's far, I know. And so for those of you from Nigeria, I know distances in Africa are big. And I learned so much, though. I learned so much about the story, the entrepreneurial spirit there, and also the solutions that they were trying to come up with, because essentially a solution is it's got to have a problem, a real problem. And over there, a big problem was that if you wanted to get money from to your relatives in the countryside, you had to basically bring cash, and that was like a very, very risky proposition at that point. So why not use mobile phones, and at that time the flip phones, because who could afford iPhones and so on, to basically send money, and so on and on. So payments is a big. So I wrote a case on payments, crypto. Need I say more? So I wrote a case on Bitcoin and blockchain. I mean, it's funny how my past sort of comes back to not haunt me, but just to help me understand the new issues. Because for somebody who has not studied engineering, it's could be like, I don't know how to program, so I'm not even sure what this is all about. But I think you're trying to sort of analyze, understand, sort of and teach what this new technologies can do and what they cannot do. And big example is funding. So the question is, who has a big advantage? And clearly the banks have a big advantage, because they have deposits that are, or so we thought, are very sticky. And then these deposits are nearly not costing as much. Whereas for fintechs, their funding comes usually from the capital markets or privately, and they cost a lot more. So when you have a cost disadvantage, you really have to basically have a return that is sort of more than compensates for that. And so how easy that is, and so on. And so I wrote a lot about the evolution of fintech. So it's more on the strategy side, honestly, understanding where this is going, where banking is going also, how, I mean, mobile banking, if you don't have mobile banking, you don't have a bank now. So these are a lot of things that have been going on now. I can call you, Brett, about how much JP Morgan spent. I cheated. I Googled it, but I knew the ballpark. Okay, I knew the ballpark. How much did they spend last year on IT?
I'm gonna go. It's $2 billion.
Ha. The answer is no. Any second guess?
All right, 10 billion.
Close. It was $12 billion. Okay, so I mean, $12 billion for IT last year. So that tells you something, right? Basically, it tells you that you better be very strategic in how you allocate this capital, and you better understand, what exactly these new technologies are all about and where they're going. And so it's and of course you can argue, you can ask, do fintechs have 12 billion? The answer is no. So you can easily think about, okay, JP Morgan can actually buy you which is not a bad thing. And it happened to a Greek fintech last year, which was actually pretty fascinating. One of the earliest and first unicorns, as we call it. So anyway, so it's a fascinating world, how it changes, how much investment there is. So you got to now bring technology into this. And of course, you talk about digital currencies and you talk about cryptos. When I wrote this Bitcoin case, there was this imaginary scenario, but it seems very real, where a hedge fund person has to decide whether to invest in Bitcoin or not. And you get some amazing conversations among the students, because there's some who are really Bitcoin sort of how do you call it? Not just funds, but like really believe in Bitcoin and technology and where it's going. And you got this other side that is a little bit more skeptical about what problem do they solve, and then you go into this conversation about, is it an asset, is it a commodity, what is it? And then you can try to think about digital gold, and you say, oh, is it better than gold? I mean, why are we fascinated with gold for 4,000 years? And should we be fascinated with Bitcoin? And the Bitcoin itself has changed. So when I wrote this case in 2017, honestly, I wasn't sure how long Bitcoin was going to be around. And it started theoretically in 2009, but 2017, it was like at $5,000. And actually, the question is, would you buy Bitcoin? In retrospect, that's a good decision, because now it's 30. But you don't have to just say, oh yeah, I'm right, but you have to really articulate why and what's the reason and so on. So you really have to understand. Essentially, one important part is that is this going to be attractive to people with a lot of money, so institutional investors, to get into Bitcoin, and why? And I think one big change we've seen over the years, imagine if these 5 years is a little bit of the institutional investors and hedge fund managers coming in more and opening up more into Bitcoin than others. And so I just finished a case on Bitcoin 2023, we call it. So kind of like the updated Bitcoin case, just to point out some of the changes. And of course, the moment you write something, there's new stuff happening. So I wrote about decentralized finance, and what is decentralized finance? I mean, it's like quite fascinating. Basically, you can think of a world. Okay, why is it decentralized? It means that the same thing is in many places, and so there's not like one thing that controls everything, right? So there's like the same thing is like copied everywhere, and so basically that means presumably that it's I don't want to say it's safer, but imagine if you have like one thing in one database and somebody goes in and hacks your database, then wow, what am I doing? But it's harder to hack, gazillions of databases which have the same copy. Yeah? So that's sort of an original idea, which was not original. It's computer science, who came up sometime earlier. But the other funny thing is that things happen without any person sort of kind of saying, do this, do that. It's kind of like pre-coded. And so you get things that are happening because the code decides to invest in X, Y, and Z, for example. So just to make it a little more clear, in the beginning of times, you could just buy and sell Bitcoin. Fine. But can I do more with Bitcoins? Well, while they're sitting somewhere, and that's a whole other conversation, while they're sitting somewhere, why not I deposit in a crypto bank? Wow. And earn some interest. So somebody thought about, why don't I have a crypto bank where people can deposit my Bitcoins and earn some interest? Isn't that something? So that's a new innovation. And then, of course, once you have a crypto bank, the crypto bank has to lend it out at a higher rate. And then you have all these conversations about what is the right rate to lend, what is the right rate for interest rate. Meanwhile, this is happening in this in this computerized world where there is pretty much no regulation. And it's coming to a theater near you, it seems. But you can imagine what can happen, huh? And then on top of that, you can actually not just lend, you can actually invest in this crypto hedge funds, because in that space now there's also hedge funds that are basically codes that are doing things. It's really almost like watching The Matrix or watching sort of a, I don't know, Back to the Future, something like. And of course, you know, when you do things like that, there's a big potential for return, but also a big potential for a big risk. Huh? So, and then when you are out there and there's less of a regulatory environment, things can happen where it can get completely out of hand. And so we have these recent stories that are going to be litigated and make my life very interesting. You know, just I have to keep up.
It feels like an interesting time for regulation, both for banking and for crypto. And Gary Gensler, SEC, basically saying we're out to regulate crypto now in a lot of different ways. Lots of lawsuits happening. And then you also have this question of, has technology outpaced even traditional banking regulations? How quickly did the bank run on SVB happen? You obviously got other banks in the news too, but what do you make of all these stories, Yiorgos?
I think you know, there's always a catch up, right? So we have so when I wrote this case on Deutsche Bank and Basel III, you know, I asked the question to my students: why is it Basel III? Oh, because there was a Basel II before that, and before that there was a Basel I, and you know, where is Basel? It's in Switzerland, and you know, they like fondue there, and so I you know, I just bring them in there and the joke. I you know, I have my brother lives in Zurich, so, and you know, my sister-in-law is from Zurich, and so I know Switzerland quite well, but it's kind of fascinating to say, oh, you know, obviously there were like some, you know, things that happened in Basel II that didn't cover, you know, what needed to be covered. And we discovered later on that, hey, we needed actually a new regulatory environment. I mean, one thing is, and that's what this case actually is all about, is that how during 2007, 2008, the banks basically have had really exploited to have as little equity as possible within the regulatory framework. But you can imagine, you know, if you want to calculate the return on equity, which is net income divided by equity, the less equity you have, the higher the ROE. And so for CEOs, for investors, for everybody, is a great thing. But the less equity you have, the less ability you have to cushion your losses, which means the riskier you are. And so it's like this fascinating story, and you know, that Deutsche Bank at some point was earning 24% return on equity, and I asked my students, I said, who earns 24% in equity? Should a bank, you know, can you think of a bank earning this much? And it's pretty fascinating how we, you know, we when we make 24%, we think we're so smart. And I said, you know, just watch it. Just be careful. When you make a lot of money, yes, you may be very smart, but you also have taken probably a lot of risk. So you really have to understand how to manage that. Anyway, so Basel III came along and upped how much equity you need to have, and how much some of the other things that counted as equity can no longer count as equity. So, I mean, this is the fascinating world of investment banking and finance, where, you know, you're trying to really pitch and lobby the rating agencies and the regulators and say, you know what, this thing looks like equity, smells like equity, it could be equity. And it's really, you know, something in between debt and equity. So these are sometimes they're called preferreds. And anyway, I'm not going to bore you with all the details. More on this, you have to come to my class, Brett, and all of you guys, if you find it interesting. But I mean, I love this case because it really talks about essentially the interplay, there's even a word for it, Brett, which is called regulatory arbitrage. So it means that you look at the rules and you try to find ways to go around the rules, and very legal ways. So the question is, who thinks ahead of, what might happen? And, the banks can make a lot of money by engaging in this regulatory arbitrage, because that means they do something risky that the regulators don't think it's risky or haven't really accounted for it as being risky. Remember, to make money, you need to take some risk. You need to be smart as well, but you need to take some risk. And so if the regulators haven't really accounted for that risk and you do it, then you can, you do a regulatory arbitrage. And of course, that can get you into trouble, because taking a risk can get you into trouble. So then, of course, you have this new regulation that comes out after we've gotten into trouble. And an example of that is with SVB, where how fascinating the world is, because SVB was a mid-sized bank, what we call in the US mid-size. So it was between 100 and 250 billion in assets. And there was this basically quite a bit of lobbying, let's put it this way, that, hey, to keep up with the regulation, it costs us a lot of money, and we are at a competitive disadvantage versus JP Morgan that writes a check on $12 billion on IT, for example. And so then the regulation, became a little bit less stringent for them, so they didn't have to do certain things. And so, they ran into trouble because they did a lot of risky stuff, SVB, and well, I'm writing this case right now, so there's so many things there. One of it is that, should the Fed have done something different and more? And the answer is yes. If they had done the regulatory things that they could have done for the banks, let's say, that are like JP Morgan, would that saved us? The answer again is no. So you have to really now even rethink about how do you, what we call stress test a bank. A stress test means, I have an adverse scenario. Inflation goes up by, 5%, and unemployment goes up by whatever. And then I go through a mathematical model and try to see how this will impact the bank, meaning, will it have enough equity to withstand? Will it have enough cash? So we're learning so much about even the things that we had in place perhaps wouldn't have helped us with SVB, but at the same time, there was some obvious error in risk management, that they should have been really rectified before we got us into trouble. An example is they had a lot of money in treasuries. Now, treasuries are very safe, right? Except if interest rates go up and the value of treasuries go down, and you have to sell them because people are taking their money out. And this is what happened. So treasuries went down because interest rates went up. So I thought I had 100 million, but now I have 70. And meanwhile, I remember it's called run on the bank because somebody has to run to the bank. Now I don't have to run anywhere. I just press a button and I just move my money. So it's a new world of running the bank. And it all can start from a tweet. So it's just so fascinating how, you really have to think about this new environment and what it means for banking safety, but also, look, if the banks are not safe, the system is not safe, and we all can not sleep very well at night, I'll tell you that much.
All right, Yiorgos, we got just a few more minutes, if it's okay. We started a little late, so I'm going to go into bonus time.
I'm here. Okay. I'm yours.
All right. We got a question here about a case that you wrote about climate risk in banking. I appreciate people doing their homework out here. So it's called Cities. It's about Citi's net zero future. It touches on the green bond market. Do you use this case in class? Tell us a little bit, for people who haven't read the case or not as familiar. Tell us about the case, and is this a case that you use?
I'm so impressed. Now the question I have to think about is, should I tell the answer to some of the people who may take, I'm just kidding, but It's funny. I was going to talk about this. I love this case because I wrote it last year, and I taught it for the first time last year. And by the way, Citigroup was my former employer, so it was my employer during my Wall Street years between 2005 and 2007. So I still have friends who are at Citigroup, and I actually So let me impress you, Brett, with my network. The CEO of Citigroup was the boss of my boss at that time. So I know Jane Fraser quite well, I would say. I mean, quite well. I shouldn't say quite well, but I know her. And she's terrific. But now, many years later, she's the CEO of Citigroup, after she has done so many good things in different areas of Citigroup. That she was leading, and now she's the CEO. And this is like a big decision to make, which is basically we want to be net zero in 2050, and we also want to really, she starts the first day, and it's so fascinating. The first day that you come on board as a CEO, which means she has thought about all this way before. To say we're going to go and by 2030, we're going to issue $1 billion of sustainable finance, which is both green finance, but also social bonds, which is basically, and there's this whole thing about what it means to be a green bond, what it means to be a social bond. You can think about a green bond, something that helps, greening the environment, and then something that helps, let's say low, like housing for less privileged people, or, all kinds of things on the social side. And so that's the first part. But then it becomes like, all right, you're doing this big bet. The question is, why will the investors invest in those, right? That's one question. They may not really be there to help you green the environment, all right? For example, why would the issuers issue green bonds? Like, is it less costly for them? If it's less costly for them, why would the investors accept a lower return? So it's like you get into the really nitty-gritty of understanding, is there a market for green bonds? How much is there? And you can look at the data, you can understand a little bit about where it's going. Is this your big bet that you're going to place? Like, do you have an advantage? Because one of the things that happens on net impact, which is to me was very fascinating, because it was like on the bank side, is that when you want to be net zero, it means that, because what banks do is do loans to companies. That means that you have to now green your clients, which means that you have to convince them that they, it's better for them to also issue green bonds. And the question is, what if they don't want to? Would you say no? Would you basically say, okay, goodbye, I don't want you as a client anymore? And on top of that, there's like this education that needs to happen for investment bankers. There's this whole process of how do you actually get a green bond to be certified as a green bond? And investment bankers want to just do a deal and get moving to the next one. And so this is now a whole other layer of institutionally, what will that mean? But also, you can talk about the world, right? So, which is, where is it going? Is this what you would do as Jane Fraser? Like, what was your advice to Jane? Would you have recommended that she does this big bet on green bonds, social bonds, and net zero? And it was a fascinating conversation. So yeah, I learn so much every time I write a case. And thank you for somebody who's really trolling me on whatever and figuring out the cases. That's fantastic. Plus one already. You get you've already gotten points in my course.
For those of you wondering, plus one is Darden, your case, your class participation counts as part of your grade, and the faculty plus one. It's a positive thing, as you probably have inferred. So Yiorgos, last question here. what are 3 books you would recommend for our attendees, or just 3? It could be a podcast, could be a movie, could be anything. But for folks, things that you've been reading, you've been interested in.
Very good. So one advice I give my students always is read, 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 and read, and read, and read. I mean, the ideas come from reading, and reading carefully and understanding, and try to think through issues. And I start my day and I tell my students, I read the Financial Times, I read Bloomberg or CNBC, or this is sort of the start of the day. So I got to understand what the news are, what the situations happen, because those are giving me also ideas for the things I want to teach my students, right? So let's start with that. But for you guys, we're going to be on the other side, who are going to be dealing with these issues. You better understand what's going on. And that was a big lesson actually during Wall Street years, where you had to understand and read everything about the news, because imagine in Wall Street, I was talking to CFOs and treasurers all the time. And what if something had happened to that company, like a merger, acquisition, or like anything, any news, and I didn't know? Basically, what kind of banker are you? You just don't know what's going on with our company, and you're trying to advise us. So it's like a sort of almost like table stake. But in terms of books, I love a book that is a quite old one now. It's called When Genius Failed, and it's by Roger Lowenstein, and it's 2 Nobel laureates who had a hedge fund and didn't do very well. And in fact, it was the first bailout of financial institutions, essentially, I think it was 1998. So it's a great story about risk and return, and basically the theoretical bet, which was actually not just theoretical, but the theoretical premise, I should say, of the strategy, which didn't pan out. And a big part of that also lesson is that when you use a lot of debt, you don't have as much leeway, right? Too much debt allows you to put very little equity, so that means the return on equity is very high. But too much debt means that if you don't get the money that you want, that you need, the return, you can't pay the debt, and then you're done. So this is kind of what happened in that book, but it's a little bit more complicated. But anyway, so that's a fascinating book, I think, and I always advise it to my students, because in the end of the day, I tell students, what is finance? It's really about risk and return, and we can measure the return afterwards, but the risk, we do have some models, but we're not always. We're always seeking to get better at the models of understanding risk. So this is one book I highly recommend. The second book I can't really recommend, but I will recommend it because I just got it, so I haven't read it. And it's called, it's by Darden Admissions and Simon Johnson from MIT, quite famous economists. And it's called Power and Progress, I think, or something like this. I have written the title. I just got it yesterday. Power. Give me a moment. Yeah, Power and Progress, and it's a book about technology, and it's a book about how essentially the bottom line. Like I read the bottom line, which I don't know. Then now I have to read like a 700-page book. But it's the bottom line was like technology can get us to amazing places, but it can also, if you leave it unchecked, it can get us to really bad places. And so it's really a question of how do we think about the rules that we're going to put around technology, so that we can make sure that we have a productive economy and a fair economy and an equitable, and as opposed to, put like leave it like whatever, and then basically some people are going to make money, but the rest is not going to help us very much. And that's a like a big conversation right now with AI and ChatGPT and on, right? As to what kinds of regulation we're going to put. I mean, the tricky part about regulation, Brett, is that you got to understand the problem, and then you have to put the right regulation so that there is very little room for regulatory arbitrage. So you're trying to really understand how these other players are going to try to get around it, and you try to make it as effective as possible. But until you understand the full extent of the problem, which of course it doesn't happen just like in one day. I mean, it's like, because the problem morphs and changes and becomes something different, then it's hard. At some point, of course, you have to say, I'm going to regulate. And this is what I'm going to do. This is what you can, and this is what you cannot do. But anyway, so this is, and it talks about the Industrial Revolution, for example. One example I saw where basically not everybody benefited from the Industrial Revolution. And so there are winners and losers. So technology is not the end all be all in terms of improving the world all the time. So we have to be careful. That's my understanding so far, but I may be wrong. I got to read 700 pages to tell you what's going on. Okay, third book, which could be 4 books. Third book is by my favorite. So I love history, by the way, and history is so fascinating because it can teach you things that allow you to analyze a problem, and you understand that history may repeat or may not, but it really gives you some framework. So one book is by Peter Frankopan, and he's a professor of history at Oxford, and it's called Silk Roads, and it's a very well-known book. I think it was written in 2015. What's fascinating about this book is really talking about how politics, wars, and economics are intertwined, and really talks about how essentially from antiquity, from ever, this economic interests have played into the world the way it has shaped. And you can say, oh, this is pretty obvious, but kind of taking you through the history and giving you the examples and understanding pretty much things that you didn't think it was like economic base, like they're actually, so it's not just the Silk Road, what we know from history, but there's other things that are really Silk Roads. There are kinds of Silk Roads that we didn't think they were. And so it's a fascinating book, highly recommend. And he just wrote a new book. It's called The Earth Transformed. It's also 700 whatever pages. And I know, like, I feel like so underperforming, Brett. Like, I have not written a 700-page book. So I mean, I'm so impressed by some of these guys. But anyway, he wrote about how civilizations over time have dealt with climate change or not. So essentially, what are these things that can help a civilization survive a climate change? And what are these things that they didn't do and basically, eradicated this civilization? And an example is like, the Mayans, which is sort of a theory that basically was a big drought and a big sort of a climate issue that kind of changed the route of that civilization. But anyway, so like I said, I mean, not everybody from Greece, by the way, is enchanted with history and archaeology. These are Greek words, but I am. And I always learn so much understanding sort of what happened in the world and try to bring in, and the same thing with finance, what happened in financial history, economic history, how that can inform where we're going. So yeah, it's been such a blessing and such a privilege, honestly, to be at Darden, a place where I can, think big thoughts, but also then deliver them in the classroom in such an engaging way, build these relationships that are so precious and so satisfying, and basically feel like, okay, at least they want to talk to me when I go to to Delhi or to Rio, and not just that, but they're so excited to see me again. And I'm glad I didn't say anything wrong so far. All the examples they've brought up. Oh, you said this, and I'm like, okay, it still works. Okay. So.
Well, Yiorgos, thank you so much for your time today. It's been such a pleasure having you here on Office Hours. We covered a lot of ground, and the last guest on Office Hours was Bob Bruner, the former dean of the business school at Darden, also a student of history, also a member of the finance faculty at Darden, and an avid reader as well. So it's wonderful having you here. To all of our attendees, thank you so much for taking time to join us for today's session. As always, we'll share out the recording of this session on our blog, Discover Darden, as well as our admissions podcast, Experience Darden, and the ExecMBA podcast. And we'll be back with the next installment of Office Hours in early August with Professor Tim Lassiter, talk about operations, technology, all kinds of things. So hopefully you will join us for that. But hope you have a wonderful weekend, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much, Brad. It was wonderful. I appreciate it. And thank you for tuning in from everywhere around the world.
And that was a conversation with Professor Yiorgos Allayannis, a member of the finance faculty here at the Darden School of Business, and the latest installment in our ongoing Faculty Spotlight series, Office Hours. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything you'd like for us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at Darden, that's DARDEN, @virginia.edu. Till next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.